Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third forum webinar, where we are specifically talking about the evolution of gender and business. Today, we're going to be going into an outward-facing view on business and gender diversity, where we'll be talking about respecting the value and dignity of TGNC customers. We have some great panelists today, but first, I want to personally thank our platinum sponsors for making this series possible: Delta Airlines, BlackRock, Bank of America. Thank you so much for allowing us to be able to bring folks together to have some of these important conversations. I also want to just remind folks that we are in the final days of the LGBTQ Institute Southern Survey data collection. Our hope is that we are going to be able to collect data from LGBTQ Southerners so we can help tell our story. We know that our stories can help us better write the history books, but also make sure that we're going to be able to have access to some of the necessary funds and resources that are available in cities and states across the South. Your voice really does play an important role. So feel free to go to the LGBTQ Institute website, or you can go to lgbtqsouthernsurvey.org. You see that there. If you've already taken the survey, thank you. And we would encourage you to share that with colleagues that might be interested in sharing their story as well. First, I want to introduce our first panelist, Alex Rhodes, Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Global Banking and Markets and International for Bank of America. Thank you so much for joining us today. We also have Dean Steed, who will be joining us potentially a little bit later, Communications Lead for Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative. And Jamie Ann Harrell, Business Intelligence Lead for Emory University, Goizueta Business School. I always have a problem pronouncing that name. But thank you so much for joining us and for being here today. Unfortunately, Simmons, Policy Director for the National Center for Transgender Equality, had a scheduling issue come up last minute. Sorry that he won't be able to join us, but hopefully we'll be able to provide some insights in our final packaging of this webinar, along with the resources that we share on our lgbtqbusinessforum.org website. With that, I want to start just by asking you all to share a little bit about how you got into the work that you do. I think it's always nice to hear from panelists, not just about their titles, but how they came to work in this arena. So Jamie, do you want to start?
Certainly. So for me, diversity, inclusion, and equity is a personal passion of mine. My day job is really data analytics at Goizueta Business School. But Goizueta is connected to my journey because I was doing my MBA at Goizueta Business School between 2014 and 2016. And I came out transgender during my MBA program here at Goizueta. And I was the first openly transgender graduate from Goizueta MBA program. And my experience being part of that class and being part of business education, I think experiencing that firsthand really launched for me a journey of wanting to make sure that everyone can have as good of an experience as I did, both in school as well as in the job market. I've been exceptionally lucky, if not, falling back on some of my residual privileges of my life that were able to give me these opportunities. And I want to be able to bring that experience to more people and bring equity to more transgender people in our community.
Thank you, Jamie. Alex?
Ryan, first, thanks for the invite. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And Jamie, great to join you on this panel. Thank you for your bravery to be the first out transgender graduate of a business school in the South. Says a lot. So I know that was probably not an easy journey, and hopefully some of our dialogue today will help explore some of that and tips and things that we can share with others who are joining us. My own journey, I think, came from not having visible out leaders throughout my career. I spent the majority of my career in banking, in the business, in the closet, not really being able to be my true self. And I think that built allyship to other communities as well, whether it's Black or Hispanic or communities that are underrepresented today, and understanding what it's like to not be able to look around and see people that you identify with in corporate America. And we have, I think a real challenge in people feeling comfortable to bring their whole selves to work, but to even self-identify, even in confidential HR systems, to be able to say that I identify with this community, let alone what it's like to be out in the office space. So I think, being able to be a visible leader, but also to pave the way for others. And for those that really did, make a commitment of allyship. I think that's the other part to all of this work, is that we start talking about the transgender community, gender non-conforming, non-binary communities. It's a similar state of not being able to see that representation. And what can we really be doing as companies in corporate America, both internally for our employees, but also for the clients and communities we serve. And I'm excited to get the chance to talk today about what Bank of America is doing, but how all of us can really be a catalyst for change. I think that's what's driven the passion. Very similar, Jamie, like this is my day job, but I'm not even sure if I get a paycheck, because the work that I do really is around the passion, and however many hours it takes to be able to pave the way for others is where my commitment is.
I really appreciate that, Alex. And I want to echo what you just said about not seeing people in business or that you recognize as trans. And I had that experience when I was working with the undergraduate group here at Emory. There was a trans support group or trans talk group. And I went to that. I was, in the executive MBA program, so I was like 40 something. But there were a whole bunch of undergrads there that were trans and working through their life in school and going to be entering the workforce. And after earning their trust of being there for a few meetings, one of the young trans students said to me that they had never seen a person who was trans and successful in business and happy. And they were worried about their future. And I was able to show them a little bit through my own visibility that you can be happy, you can be successful. And I think being able to see coworkers, being able to see leaders in your field that are open and out and happy and successful is exceptionally important, not just for the visibility that it brings, but because you know that they're in the room when the decisions are being made in the businesses that you're participating in.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Jamie. And I want to get a little bit into your thoughts and feelings on how each of your institutions are trying to make sure that they are representing, reflecting the TGNC community, whether from a corporate standpoint, from an educational institution standpoint, things that you're most proud of that you all are doing that shows your level of commitment to move the ball forward.
Would you like me to share?
Sure.
Okay. So when I think about it from a corporate perspective, I know we've had prior conversations of your webinar is talking about the internal piece. So I'm going to focus kind of exclusively on a couple of things that Bank of America is doing externally to really interact with the transgender, gender non-conforming community. The first is when you think about just conducting basic banking operations, right? To be a customer to a bank and to have to be making, important financial decisions and interactions with an institution. We train our call center employees to be able to address the transgender and gender non-conforming, whether that is understanding pronouns and being able to ask clients which pronouns they want to use, as well as being able to make some difficult decisions around if you have a client calling in who may have a government ID that doesn't match their presentation, or this could be an early fraud sign, but we have to be able to go beyond that and say that's not fraud. This is someone who is in the midst of a significant life transition. How can we be there to meet them during their financial needs? So I think being able to have that empathy and understanding and be able to take your training and truly be able to serve the client has been key. So in a lot of our call center environments, that's become a number one priority, to be able to understand our clients. Kind of switching then, I'll just share a couple of quick examples, then we can maybe dive deeper into it. The other piece is around financial advice. So we have financial advisors through our Merrill Lynch brand that are non-binary, that are gender queer, and are servicing a book of business for clients that represent that, who do have the ability to want to make those financial plans And I think it's so key that we have advisors who are them, right? We see you because we are you, and we can help from a financial planning perspective for those communities because we specifically understand them. And then the third piece that's often kind of a touchy subject, and it really is about the underbanked. And we know that in the transgender community, many times just building some of those basic abilities to bank with confidence, there's a challenge. So we've launched a number of products that have evolved recently into what we call the Balance Connect program, which really does help those that are trying to establish their banking relationships and bank with confidence. And we know that disproportionately transgender, gender nonconforming who may be working their way up to establish themselves need some of that additional safety and security in their basic banking needs. So whether you're calling in an existing client, whether you're building a portfolio, or you're just starting banking relationships, we really have tried to be out there to understand the needs of the community.
Thank you for that, Alex.
Thanks for that. And at Emory, we're focusing in multiple ways. For example, we're not just a research and business education institution, but we're also, I believe at this point, one of the, if not the largest employer in Atlanta. And so we're reaching the community in multiple ways in terms of students, in terms of partnerships with businesses that we do business with. But really, our mission here at Wayzata includes educating the next generation of business leaders. And I think the next generation of business leaders is the young students when they're coming into Wayzata, they're expecting to learn about how businesses can create equity for marginalized people and marginalized employees. And I think developing courses and programs around that and developing processes to make sure that we're dealing with not just how to teach that, but dealing with students that are trans or gender nonconforming is really important. And so we're working hard to make that work here. And we make mistakes like all companies do, like all people do. And I like to say there's room for intent in diversity and equity and inclusion, but there's also a need to understand the responsibilities of the results or the consequences of actions when we make mistakes. And so we always measure, we measure the outcome based on how it affected somebody. But then when we are dealing with intent, then we have personal connections that we can give grace to one another when we make mistakes. I think that's super important. But I got off on a tangent. But other ways that Emory is working with the business community, for example, is with our suppliers. And I think exporting that equity that we want to create internally through relationships with suppliers is super important out to our community as well. With suppliers, for example, we can ask organizations who want to host, for example, female entrepreneurships on Emory's campus, if they want to create seminars and organizations want to host events here at Emory that are focusing on women, we can ask them, is your organization explicitly inclusive of transgender women? And so we can ask those questions and we can prompt those conversations that then begin to export that culture that we have of inclusion into those suppliers that we have. And I think that's an important way to really ask our suppliers, ask our partners to further the mission that we have of inclusion.
Well, and Jamie, you just recently authored an article that we'll make sure is included as part of this webinar, where one of the things you mentioned is that you have worked with companies that have the best policies that you've seen, but they're just not implemented. In the right ways. And so I'm curious as to, the idea of what to do in that case. You can have the best, there's a difference between policy and practice. You can have the best policy in the world, but if it's not put into practice, we've saw even in our own Southern survey that you can have a business resource group and that you can check off a box for that, but it doesn't mean that everyone's attending. There's a variety of reasons for that. So what are some of the learnings that you've experienced in trying to bring together the policy and the practice?
So I think sometimes we have to recognize that, or we always have to recognize that businesses are made of people. And both people make mistakes and people have different ideas and different philosophies. And sometimes it doesn't always align with what the goals of the organization are, and we need to be able to have those conversations and grace around those. But I think in order to have a culture that permeates through to the organization, you have to look at it holistically and you have to measure. There's a couple of things that we teach in operations management here at Voice Wedded is that you have to know where you compete as well as where you don't compete. You have to know what's important to you as an organization as well as what's not. And so you have to really enumerate in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, what are the list of groups based on actual dimensions of diversity that are marginalized in your business, in your community, and focus task forces on those. And so measure what those task forces are going to, what they're going to achieve and how they're achieving. And so this is a lifelong journey. I had a question one time, a person asked me, when is all this DE&I stuff going to be over? And it's not, because it's part of business now, it's part and parcel. And you need to evaluate all of your internal policies, documents, and procedures to make sure they're there, and make sure that you're having trainings with each of the groups in your company, because there could be parts of your company that you're not reaching with emails, for example. You might have to have in-person meetings. Depends on how big your organization is and what type you are. But you need to educate across the entire business. I'm actually coming up here with 4 E's and a P. I hope Jack Welch Institute doesn't take me to task on that. You need to educate across the entire business. Perhaps host out in business panels and invite other trans people from outside of your organization. Don't just rely on the staff that you have that's marginalized to lift up your business. Bring people from the outside. Bring speakers who are experts in their field to speak in areas of your business that you're going to provide some training in. You don't have to bring a trans person in to talk about equity and inclusion. You can bring a trans person in to talk about business intelligence and analytics and show that there are experts in the field who are trans, and that may speak to someone in your business that did not actually consider trans people in their business. Host a common read. I think this is a great way for people to connect at work, but still kind of on a less kind of demanding in-class session where you're learning things. But host a common read. Read a book by Jenny Finney Boylan. And have conversations around the business as to what that means. And maybe on Trans Day of Visibility, highlight important trans people in business. The founder of Exxon Radio was a transgender woman. The author of VLSI Design was a transgender woman. The synth pop, the recording of Switched on Bach on the Moog synthesizer, she was a transgender woman. So there's all kinds of entrepreneurial people that you can bring into your business. And then finally, for the last E, invest in equity and the inclusiveness of transgender people. Make sure that your policies, your medical policies, don't exclude, have specific exclusions on trans coverage that you might consider to be, cosmetic. Some of us need to feel recognized for who we are, both audibly and visually. And that includes some things that may be considered cosmetic in some places, but for us, it's not. It's medically necessary. And fund your ERG, because that's going to have tentacles out into areas of your organization that your policies and procedures may not hit. I hope I haven't taken too long and been too long-winded on that answer, but I think there's many, many things that you can do, and it comes with attention to detail, and finally the P, make it a priority that we address LGBTQ needs in business. That goes back to my first point. We teach that you need to have an understanding of your strategy based on what you do as well as what you don't do. And if you don't make it a priority, you haven't said, these are the groups that we consider are marginalized, then when things come up that are DEI related, but they're tangentially connected, but not necessarily connected to a group of people that are marginalized, then you're going to know we're not going to attack that particular, we're going to focus over here.
Well, and to that point, Jamie, about knowing your strengths, but also knowing your weaknesses or where you compete and where you don't. Clearly, there is huge opportunity for businesses to be much more inclusive than what they are, especially when we talk about the higher ranking officials within businesses. And Alex, this is a question to you. Do you feel like knowing that could be a competitive advantage, do you feel like that the businesses are starting to be more thoughtful about understanding that this could be a strength if they invested in it?
Yeah, Jamie raised some good points, and I think, Ryan, you're following up on that. it really is about creating that inclusive culture within the company so you can display that externally. You don't understand the needs of your clients and customers or the community if you don't have that representation within your own company and have those voices. We're excited this year. We have our first transgender out at work executive. So within 3 levels from the CEO of our organization, considered a senior leader, has now identified as trans. And we're so proud to have Lori and her work. In fact, she sits in the Atlanta area. So it's great to not only have a transgender woman, but to be a woman in the South taking such a visible role, and is helping us drive even more of our priorities because of that. And Jim, you said some good things too around accountability. Again, I think companies internally have to have the accountability so that externally you can drive in a leadership role. We do a couple of things. One is our human capital management report. We're proud to share our representation metrics of who we are as a company internally. That keeps us accountable externally as well. But then you said something too, Jamie, that caught my attention around understanding, are we meeting the needs of our employees, especially our transgender employees? We do an annual employee satisfaction survey as well as D&I engagement survey, where we ask those really tough questions about, are we delivering and allowing people to bring their whole selves to work, and are your managers welcoming and inclusive? It's completely confidential, including self-ID. So we have some of the highest percentages of self-ID of the LGBTQ plus community in this ESAT survey. And we're able to actually break it down by transgender. While our overall company scores are very high compared to peer groups, our transgender teammates are 5 points higher in employee satisfaction and D&I engagement than our total population. And that would be the perfect time that if a transgender employee is not satisfied, or to be completely confidential, they could absolutely let us know. Instead, we're 5 points higher with that community. So I think it does go back to where you were saying, Jim, you've got to not only have the policies, which we have no exceptions around cosmetic or other parts related to transgender reassignment and other surgeries, fully funded through our programs because we're self-directed in terms of our insurance coverage. But then the fact that our employees are recognizing the work and they see themselves and being visible. So I think that all leads, back to that external piece where we can light up our buildings in Charlotte in the transgender flag colors. We fly a transgender flag outside of our corporate headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina, on multiple Transgender Day of Visibility and Transgender Day of Remembrance. That's kind of unheard of. We use the Progress flag that has both the transgender flag and the Pride flag in our financial centers. So at over 2,500 financial centers around the country, customers walk in during Pride Month or other months throughout the year when we're highlighting special days of visibility and see a Progress flag that brings together the transgender community and the LGBTQ plus community. So again, I think you've got to be able to walk the talk internally so that you can reflect that externally with your clients and customers.
I think that's so amazing. And also, I want to thank you and congratulate you. I was at a conference in Fort Lauderdale. It was a trans conference, and the building there across from Las Olas Boulevard was lit up pink and blue in honor of our conference. And I really appreciate that. I think, in terms of seeing representation and seeing flags, one of the things that we have here that I want to come back to at Goizueta is we have flags from every country in the world hanging in our commons area for our students. And it's often that that foreign students will come to Goizueta and they'll walk the hall, and they've commented to our leaders of the MBA program and said, I felt so warm when I saw my flag hanging in your commons area, and it just connected with me, and I feel welcome here. And we're now hanging the Progress flag in the same hall that has all of the countries for telling people that you're welcome here. And it's such an amazing thing to see that and to feel that when you feel it for the first time.
I love that. And I want to, we've talked a little bit about some things that need to happen internally in order to be able to talk externally. But do you feel businesses are at all prepared for the evolution of gender, given a recent study found that 50% of Gen Zers believe that traditional gender norms are outdated, that American society will associate gender less with stereotypical personality traits, products, and occupations within the coming decade. And more than that, 52% believe that gender is not binary, that there's a spectrum of gender identities. Given this, doing the work internally, knowing that there is a cost to not being diverse and inclusive internally, but do you think that they understand that in terms of how they represent themselves in the world, whether it be marketing, advertising, or advocating even for the transgender, gender nonconforming community?
So I think businesses are beginning to understand today that if they don't change, but the generation and the next generation of business leaders that we're teaching are hopefully going to embody this as well. But if they do not change the way that they market and they connect to communities around them, not just their employees, but communities around them, that they will be beaten out of the market by the companies they do. And I wanted to talk about a question that was posed to me that I think ties directly into this, Ryan, that I would really like to hear yours and Alex's thoughts about it. I have my own as well, but I was doing a DE&I talk at an event that included a significant number of publishers. And one of the publishers, after my talk, came up to me with a question that I want to pose today. And paraphrasing, because when they asked me the question, it wasn't quite as respectful as the way that this is going to be worded, but he asked, if there's a marginalized community, such as the trans population, that represents 1% of less of the US population, how can I convince my advertisers to address that segment in their advertising, even if it isn't large enough to yield a significant return on their investment? So how are we convincing businesses to be inclusive of their trans community around them, even though it may not return on investment or it may not be profitable, which alludes to the questions that I was asking in the essay that I wrote about, has the business case for diversity and inclusion itself, just the opportunistic business case, not done enough? And do we have to go further than that? So I'm curious, Alex or Ryan, if you have your own thoughts on these topics.
My take on that, Jamie, is I think it depends of where people are in their journey as a company. And certainly, like you said, the amplification of DE&I efforts within corporate America is turbocharged right now. I certainly think post George Floyd, it turned a whole nother chapter. I think the conversation that happened, especially this last year during Pride Month, of this pride washing and our companies only doing during a certain time, that's creating a lot of pressure too, to be accountable. We're seeing the same things in how we're responding to certain anti-trans legislation across states. We're happy to be joined with HRC in supporting their transgender justice initiative because we believe it's so important. Supporting the work that they're doing. I think we have to do it nonstop. But I think more specifically, I feel like if you're not stepping up, again, back to internal, you're going to feel that heat. The business case, if you're early in your journey, you're going to have, and I think your article points out, you're going to have a higher set of debt or liabilities on that P&L statement you've got to dig out of, and you're not going to see that ROI immediately. For companies like ours who are, we've had a D&I council for 20 plus years. Our CEO has chaired that D&I council for 13 of those 20 years. It starts at the top, to the point now where Brian Moynihan says, we don't have a business case for diversity and inclusion. It's the right thing to do, full stop. We're not trying to justify it. We've held marketing campaigns that have transgender teammates in national commercials that show transgender teammates. We have marketing displays where transgender teammates are prominent in that marketing display in certain regions because we know how important that is. That work has to continue. But to your point, for companies who are just starting this journey, that hill is steep. I think the silver lining is that companies can accelerate at a much faster pace than the 20-year journey we've been on. They can probably accomplish what we've done in 20 in 5 just because of how the climate has changed and the priority companies are putting on this. So I think it's a top-down approach in terms of seeing your senior leaders support this work to say that the business case doesn't have to be justified. It's the right thing to do. Having your employees support that, but then being visible in the communities so that you really can direct that work. And there is not a single formula for diversity, equity, inclusion. It's all things. You have to really be able to operate in a multi-dimensional way.
Alex, I would just kind of piggyback off that. I also think it's a matter of the size of the company, but also themselves knowing who their customer base is. So they knowing where they compete, where they don't compete. So for smaller, businesses that don't view themselves as being a company that values diversity, that they actually operate in a different, mindset, they may not care. But I think it's the larger corporations that we look to really help steer the direction of where we're going. When we look at that recent article or that recent survey that said 52+% of Gen Zers view gender as something other than binary. For major corporations, understanding that that is encompassing a lot of folks, including trans folks, who want to be represented. And so I think, to your point, Alex, it's about making sure this is just part of what you do to represent the human population, specifically here in the United States, as we're talking about. So I think it's thinking about how we represent the diversity of our country in a variety of ways. But I think, Jamie, to your point about the business case, that oftentimes when people are trying to justify, especially when it comes to the LGBTQ community, money and dollar amounts, I think that's where especially folks who may be resistant to specifically talking about or working to make sure trans folks are included in advertising or marketing, might get pushback because of your point about what they consider too small of a population. So I think your point about making it a general conversation about how a company wants to see itself is important. The Business Roundtable recently decided to move that their primary goal wasn't just stakeholder revenue. Thank you. Shareholder revenue. Thank you. Shareholder revenue. It's also about making sure that they are acting as good business partners and community members in the world. So we're starting to see a shift, I think, in how businesses see themselves in the world. That's how I would respond.
And I'd layer back in intersectionality, right? As Gen Z kind of loses some of their labels, which I think is probably, it makes sense. We also have to look to these communities when we look at Black and Hispanic communities as well, to understand that the LGBTQ+ lens runs through those communities as well, and what they can do to be more welcoming, as well as, add an intergenerational lens to that. So I hope anyway that companies really start to see the advantages, small or large, to understanding that the populations you have bring such a unique set of backgrounds. And I'll add one more in there. It's from the parents' perspective, right? One of the largest segments we have today in our LGBTQ employee resource group are parents who are dealing with youth, not just coming out in college or coming out in high school, but who are identifying at very young ages, somewhere, again, in that gender spectrum. And they're coming to their company seeking that. So whether you're a small company, it can impact anyone. We don't know. So you can't ignore it and say, well, we're not big enough to have an LGBTQ+ employee resource group, or we don't have resources that we want to put towards that. At this point in time, again, the intersectional lens of your workforce today, you're going to have somebody who's impacted. And can you be an employer of choice, as well as a client, a customer lens, a company of choice, to really reflect those needs?
And I think, as Ryan, you mentioned, a couple of years down the road, that the next generation of consumers and business leaders are going to have these expectations of gender diversity and an understanding of the spectrum, or gender as a spectrum rather than as a binary. And I think that it's important to also talk about how to go about that today, even though, it may be 10 years down the road before we have this kind of huge shift in the demographics of the purchasers, but how are we going to deal with that today? And I think one of the important things of that is to understand, when you're marketing to the LGBT community, that you're marketing to the community as a whole. But if you're leaving a part of that segment out because it might not be as profitable as the rest of the segment, then you're exploiting the rest of that segment at the expense of the marginalized. And I think people begin to think, are you doing good or are you doing evil? And are you creating more inequity than equity than you're creating. And I think investors are going to begin looking at companies that way. So I think companies begin thinking about it that way sooner rather than 10 years down the road when consumers are really making those choices for them. So the other way that I think we as a community can really have a voice in that conversation is through allyship, through LGNB parts of the population saying, you know what, we're not going to do business with you if you leave out our siblings who are part of this group that you're claiming to support, part of the, I think what Alex, you alluded to in terms of, rainbow capitalism and just focusing in on parts of the community that's profitable. And we need to hold those companies accountable when they're leaving marginalized people out.
I appreciate that, Jamie. And we have had a question come in that how do you best communicate corporate DEI and become known as a company of choice to recruit at early career and non-early career levels?
I'll share one example of something we're doing right now. We're proud to be one of the lead sponsors for Trans Can Work, which is an organization that has amplified the importance of the transgender community in the workforce today. And certainly when you look at a labor market today, you've got to be looking across all communities, but to have a group that we're happy to help champion and sponsor that's just focused on the transgender community. This is now 2 years ago, pre-pandemic. They held one of their first in-person session career fairs in Los Angeles. They had 500 people attend this career fair who were transgender. We were proud to be one of the companies there, but we had people that had, multilingual, multi-degrees, that because of their transgender status had not been able to find permanent employment. Those are people that we would scoop up in a heartbeat to start careers at our companies. So I think that's just first of being able to have your ear to the ground. And, they talk about really going where the people are. You have to be able to look at the transgender community, gender non-conforming community as a key source that many times have had skill sets that haven't been able to be fully optimized because of their challenges in finding work in communities or in corporate America. And that comes back to paying a living wage. Bank of America is at $21 an hour now, on our way to $25 an hour. If you think about someone who's transgender, we don't require a college degree, even a high school GED, to be able to enter into the workforce and start at a company at $25 an hour. That's life-changing. When you see the stats, unfortunately, around the unhoused population, 50% could be LGBT, and even higher percent within that are transgender. We as companies, large and small, have to be creating pathways to careers for these underserved populations.
And I think to be a company of choice, you have to look introspectively first. You have to have inclusion in place. We always talk about DE&I, but you have to be a company that's inclusive before you begin to try to become a company of choice. And then once you've at least tackled some of this internally before going out and recruiting people, because if you bring people in and you haven't created inclusion, then they're going to bounce right out because they're not going to feel it, and they're going to feel the need to move elsewhere to a company of choice. Now, once you've worked on that internally, I think there's some very important steps that you need to take. And I liken this to recruiting any underrepresented group or any marginalized community. Is if you're always hiring from the same places, as Alex said, you have to go to where the people are. If you're always hiring, I'll pick on one of my alma maters, Georgia Tech. If you're hiring engineers and you're always going to Georgia Tech for engineers, you're always going to get the same profile of candidates that's coming from that. If you're not going to the HBCUs that are right here in Atlanta, you're not going to create equity. You're not going to create a diverse employment group. And so you need to go to where the people are. And I think once you get there, the next step is you have to create a slate that is diverse for the position that you're hiring. I'm not saying hire for diversity. I'm saying have a slate that's diverse, and you will find candidates who are qualified that are going to satisfy diversity requirements around that slate. If 50%, whatever your number is, 75% of your slate, the people who you're going to interview for this job are diverse, they're going to be qualified, and you're going to hire a more diverse group. So not hiring for diversity, but making sure the slate is diverse, going to those places where you're going to find people who are not the typical, engineers that you would otherwise hire, or from Emory, not the typical accountants that you would hire for if you're always going to Emory for accountants to the business school, then you're going to get the exact same profile every single time.
Rich, thank you for that question. And for anybody else who's interested in submitting a question, feel free to add to the chat or raise your hand. I wanted to ask you both, you're both in positions of power within your organizations. You both are advocates for the TGNC community. What has been some of your experiences in trying to advocate for a greater visibility of your company within these communities?
I'll share an example, I guess, when we think about external, again, thinking about how we raise visibility. We're proud to be a partner with Out and Equal, and the work that they're doing around transgender inclusiveness is so important. We are sponsoring programs for an entire pipeline. So whether you are sitting in a college campus program today, I mean, we're going to have Gen Zers in college summer intern programs this year and next year who may have transitioned at 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old and are now in a college situation. Do they even know that corporate America is friendly to them, right? So I think there's a message we've got to get out there at that stage. And then you look at all the leadership development programs that companies have, and even external programs. I often spend a lot of time with partners around Black and Hispanic communities and developing, or women developing those programs. But what are we really doing for LGBTQ plus leaders, especially from the transgender, gender nonconforming, that have not had that equity, that equal access to opportunity for development programs? They can't be left behind. So I think that's kind of key to the journey that we're on as well. Jimmy, I'll let you maybe share a couple of thoughts too. We can bounce back and forth.
Sure. So there's a couple of initiatives here at Emory and at Goizueta that are aimed specifically at entrepreneurship for marginalized communities. And there's a Start Me program that's part of the Goizueta. We have an incubator accelerator program that helps companies get off the ground. And I work really closely with that group to make sure that when they're focusing their energy and money on, for example, women-owned, women-started entrepreneurships, women-started businesses, that they're saying explicitly that includes transgender women, that it's not binary as a gender, or that the programs that we have allow non-binary representation in them. We have at Emory, we've started to use to include non-binary as a gender that you can include on your application and in your program. And I often say, I like to quote an NPR interview with Charles Bolden, who was the first Black administrator of NASA, who was famously asked, what is the importance of being first? Being the first Black administrator of NASA. And he said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter until there's a second. Because if you don't have a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth, you haven't changed the cultural conditions that set it up so that there wasn't a first yet. And so at Emory, I like to see, I used to be able to say that I was still the first, but we now have had, by introducing a non-binary identity into the ability for students to self-identify, we've had students that have identified as non-binary. And it's a beautiful thing to no longer be the first or the only. And I think Emory is doing a pretty good job at that. It's difficult, I find, to advocate within your own organization because you're putting a lot of personal capital on the line. And I do that as best I can, but I think sometimes that can be difficult, and perhaps I could do better with that. But I think Emory's doing a fairly good job of that, and I look forward to doing more of that in the future.
One of my questions pertains around advertising, and I was curious as your thoughts on who should advertisers reach out to when they're thinking about creating campaigns that are going to include TGNC folks. Obviously, they should reach out to TGNC folks, but how should they approach them, and how should they make sure that they are incorporating their feedback in real ways, especially if the feedback they're getting is not so comfortable with folks that might be in the C-suite or have to make those decisions? How should one navigate that?
I just use the example I shared before that we've had national advertisements where we have transgender teammates in those commercials, airing on TV and in print. And I don't think there was the discussion of, do we put one or the other, or is this going to, what's the impact going to be? It was, we want to show the diversity of our teammates. We look like the clients and communities we serve, and that includes a Black transgender woman from the South who works at our company, and we want to see represented in how we talk about our company. Are there downsides to that? Are you going to have pushback? Do we get, I'm sure, emails that come in of people who disagree with our promotion of the LGBTQ plus community? But that, those voices don't represent the equality that we're striving for, the advocacy that we have for the community, and you have to push forward. We certainly live in some polarized times where I think, if you managed your organization through tweets or what people post or responses that people have, we won't get very far in this journey. So I think from an advertising perspective, to us, it's about truly showcasing who we are. And that's who we are. That's who America is. That's who our country is. That's who our global clientele is. And we want to be able to share that with the community.
Alex, I think you hit it right on, perfectly, that if you don't have that representation in your business, if those voices aren't in the room when the decisions are being made, then you're not going to reach that audience exactly right. You're going to make mistakes. And so, Alex, I think that was exactly right. Your internal employees are, you're wanting to show who you are to the world. And there's no better way to do that than have people in the company that look like the people that you want to sell to. Now, I would also go even further and say, hire talent for that. Don't only fall back and use your employees. That's a great way to do it, but also hire talent for that. There's quite a movement lately to make sure that trans people are represented by trans actors in the industry. There are plenty of models, actors, etc., that you can hire as well for those commercials. And then when you have the script and they look at it and they say, you know what, I wouldn't say this way. Maybe listen to them and let them tell you more about their journey and more about the way they might approach the same situation. So I think having your marketing team be flexible when it comes to having diverse groups who maybe they weren't in the room when the decision was being made, they might say, let's change this up a little bit and roll with that. And I think finally, having diverse people on your board. There are very well qualified transgender people in the world. Alex, you said you have a senior vice president here in Atlanta who has come out trans as recently. And there are, as I mentioned earlier, some entrepreneurs who are exceptionally talented who could serve on your board. I know quite a few of them myself. That those decisions being made at the highest level need to also include diverse voices, and not just trans people, but that's the conversation we're having today.
I'll add to that, Jimmy, even on, again, kind of going back internal, but board representation. We were surprised to learn that there's only about a dozen plus companies out of the S&P 500 that include sexual orientation and gender identity in their board considerations. We not only have that in our language, but we also allow our board members to self-ID, to be able to create that at all levels of our company, including the board. But that's not very common. Again, a dozen or so companies out of the top 500 companies that have that inclusive language. Where are the other 480 some that should be stepping up to that? And maybe they have plenty of other inclusive policies everywhere else, but there's some things like that again, I think set the right tone, even if it's the start. And I think the other part I would add on to Jamie is, are we going to have transgender, gender nonconforming representation everywhere in our company? Not yet, unfortunately, but it's about the allies and advocates that are a part of employee resource groups, that are attending those courageous conversations and hearing from employees, that are creating that connection and that empathy that I think really allows people to understand that, my background and experiences will never be of a transgender woman, but I can certainly advocate for that community in the work that I do. And we have to be able to have that, I think, thought leadership in as many parts of the company as we can until we continue to grow that representation.
If I can jump in, I think I focus a lot on trans women, and when I ask these questions, because women typically, particularly in leadership, are also not as well represented as men in leadership of these large companies and on the boards. But I think I am remiss not to also include specifically transgender men and non-binary people. I think if you are focusing your inclusion in the non-binary arena, I really believe that that encompasses those of us in the trans community that are binary. If you are creating inclusion for the most marginalized of your group, non-binary, Black trans women, the various intersectional identities that are the most marginalized, if you're aiming for that, for inclusion in your organization, then you'll have already included me. So I know I focus a lot on trans women because that's my experience and that's what I know, but I really want to say, work towards non-binary inclusion because that's really the future of the understanding of gender.
As we wind down, sorry, Alex, were you going to say?
I was going to tag on one more thing, just back to the whole advertising piece. It really does come back to gender neutral advertising. That's something that, we're all working hard in the language that we use. And again, whether it's advertising or it's a form you're filling out with a company that gives you a mix opportunity, MX, to be able to address somebody, like those are all steps that companies can take. I'll give some early credit to the airlines. I think United Airlines was one of the first ones to offer that for passenger details. Those are steps that start to spread quickly and start to recognize the non-binary, but as well as just having a gender neutral approach to all that we do. It's so ingrained in that binary male female that it is taking corporate America, I think, a longer time to potentially unwind some of that and recognize it. We've got a few of our external client facing systems where we've been able to make that change. We've got a ways to go, but the priorities internal are allowing us to have that plan over the next couple of years to do that. But companies have to, I think, really understand that in their advertising, but even in their own systems and forms and how you communicate with your clients and letters that you may send out, communications, others, while it might not be advertising, it's how you're engaging with your client base that the simplest thing you can do is just start at gender neutral.
Yeah, if you have a job position that you're posting and it says he or she, just use they. You really mean they, you might as well say they, and it takes that out of it. If you, all of your internal documents, there's no reason to ever use he/she anywhere. They works perfectly well, both in the singular as well as the plural. In your job descriptions, pass it through a gender detector. There's ways to find biased language in your position descriptions that is actually implicitly creating barriers for women and non-binary people to join your company. There's a lot of things that you can do. Thanks for bringing up specifically, taking gender out of policies, procedures, and advertising and marketing.
I appreciate both of you. And as our time winds down, some of the things that I keep hearing in our conversation is the idea of being authentic, of empathy. And I think it's really important as consumers and customers are starting to demand more from the brands that they choose to purchase. They're wanting to know more about its background, what they're doing. And so I think you both have laid out some very clear ways in which your businesses, but other businesses can learn from you about ways to make it much more accessible, understandable to the consumer about what you're doing to make sure that you are reaching out to the TGNC community in real and authentic ways. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with today?
I'd like to say anywhere that you use the word gender, also include the word gender identity or the phrase gender identity, because trans people still today will question, what does it mean when you say we don't discriminate by gender? Does that mean, is that inclusive of non-binary people? Is that inclusive of transgender people? We had to have a Supreme Court ruling that actually said that, yes, that includes transgender people. So we're still suspicious a bit of any language that doesn't explicitly include us. So I would say, if you are wanting to signal inclusion, you've done the work internally to make inclusion happen, and you want to signal that externally, still use the phrase gender identity everywhere you use the phrase gender.
And I would share one of the things that we talked about is just intersectionality, to connect with more communities that represent the transgender and gender nonconforming community. We have to be looking at all identities across race, ethnicity, and gender identity to connect with them and truly be able to bring them into our companies, into the conversation, be visible in advertising, because this is a journey that we're on. And, you know, applaud corporate America for what feels like a long journey is a pretty rapid acceleration of LGBTQ plus representation. I think now it's about, you know, all parts of the LGBT and Q and the plus that need to be represented in the work that we do.
Jamie, Alex, thank you both for being willing to join us here today. Thank you everybody who has joined us in the webinar. And for those who will watch this later, I hope this has been informative, impactful, and I hope we can all get the chance to chat again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.